Hi, I'm Vishnu Srinivas, and welcome to Hawkeye. I started this podcast to give professionals an open platform to share their candid views on topics impacting businesses and economies around the world. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe.
Joining me today is Joseph Politano. He is an economic analyst at Apricitas. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be on.
Awesome. So, do you want to get into a introduction about your background and how you arrived at your role?
Yeah, so before the pandemic, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. So I was actually working abroad in Uganda. And then obviously COVID hit. I had to come back to the US, which was very sad. And then I moved back to Washington, D.C. I worked very briefly for federal government for a little over a year and a half. And then I was on the side writing all of these essentially just free newsletter pieces on the economy and what was going on, trying to do data analysis of what is over the last 2 years a very hectic economy, to say the very least. And then very recently, I had the great privilege of being able to launch that as a business, as my full-time job. So now I write Apricitas every day. That's what I do.
That's such a cool job, actually. But before we get into obviously more of the work that you do there, kind of very interested in like the role that you had in Uganda. So I understand you worked as a business development advisor there. Can you speak more to that experience and some of the high level takeaways that you gained from it, and maybe how it helped like shape, your views on how like policies are implemented and other stuff?
Yeah, I think so for people who don't know, the Peace Corps program is basically this federal government program. You enroll and you're sent to a foreign country for a little over 2 years, and you have a big project, a general focus area, and then you go into community and you're supposed to come up with specific interventions to try to assist people. And then it's also like a diplomatic organization. The goal is to get people from the US learning about other countries and vice versa. Unfortunately, I was not there for the full 2 years. I was there for about 9 months total in Uganda, but it was still it's a very good experience in that you just get to appreciate other people's perspectives. I think what's beautiful about economics to me is that everybody participates in it, willingly or not. What
Yeah.
that means is that it's shaped by everyone's choices. And in a country like Uganda, the there's so much that's the same, so much that's different. And I think I had this unique opportunity because Uganda is a very young country in terms of population distribution. And someone's going to correct me on the statistics on this, but it's like the average age is like 16, 17. It's not even a full adult. Most people are under the age of 18. So you have this opportunity. And what most of my interventions were targeted towards was like helping teenagers, especially teenage women, with interventions that could help them be more economically independent, maybe earn income outside of the house, or be able to produce more just in general, or to further their educational attainment, things like that.
Right.
And I think the other thing you come to appreciate is the great privilege, great injustice of being able to live in a country like the US where I was born.
Yeah.
And like the fact that there is such a birth lottery where you're born determines how much how you're treated as a kid, how much your parents make, how much you make as an adult.
Right.
And that to me, I think the goal of economics as like a field is to make real improvements in real people's lives, and that has to be concentrated on the people who need it the most.
Yeah, that's a super important perspective to keep in mind. So now I guess let's get back to an issue that is definitely affecting almost everyone participating in the economy, and that is inflation, which we've beat a dead horse over for the past 2 years. But I guess at this point, do you think that we can say, for the most part, that inflation is here to stay in some capacity?
It depends on your time frame. So if you're looking at things over the next year, it's very hard to see how you're going to get like core services inflation, rent, some like labor intensive goods that make up the bulk of like the US economy, it's hard how you're going to get the prices of those unofficial indexes to come back down to a normal growth rate.
Yeah.
I think there's a plausibility, like if you were to look at market pricing right now, I know ICE, Intercontinental Exchange, does like some good data on this. They basically say 3%, 3.5% CPI by the end of next year. That's like, compared to right now, that seems very rosy. But, you know, keeping in mind that if you had told someone in 2018, 2019, like, oh, we hit 3.5% inflation and most of it's core, most of it's actually, you know, projected in the future right now, a lot of it's energy, but most of it will be core. They'd be like, oh, something had to have gone horribly wrong. So to that extent, I think it is, you know, a little stickier than people would like. I think the one thing people tend to forget, it's you know, it's a growth rate, and so prices are high, prices stay high, that still can get inflation back down.
Right.
And that's not a situation that people like or enjoy, but it would be a situation where you're, you know, successful in achieving the inflation objectives. And we know, and the Fed knows, that like housing prices, which are the big cyclical component, rents like lag what's actually going on by almost a year, because of how the CPI calculates rents and how lease turnover works. So the long and short of it is, in the official statistics, we're going to see high numbers for like the near future. I am still personally of the opinion that like the big capital M macro trend of the 2010s and arguably the 2020s is like the aging of large parts of the global population in very wealthy countries. Like Japan had, you know, decades ago, is now happening to Europe, will or is kind of happening to the US and other countries, is happening to China. And that probably pulls real interest rates down. That probably makes achieving long run inflation goals more difficult. And in general, is a harder thing to change, you know, especially even during this crisis. But I think you've seen birth rates decline across the world for obvious reasons because of COVID. And then obviously there were millions of people who passed away. So if you're looking at population growth numbers, they look real bad.
Yeah.
So if you were to say like, hey, is inflation here for the next 30 years? I think markets don't buy that story right now. But obviously, if you're saying, hey guys, we're going to solve this in 30 years, that doesn't really make people happy.
Yeah.
It's probably done by 2050. We'll worry about it.
I'd hope not. But let's get more into that. That point you just brought up at the end is super interesting. You know, because we've heard I feel like I've heard for the longest time, like most media outlets, you know, we need to follow Japan's model of economic growth over the past 30 years. Like, look how steady it is. But, you know, they also have like age factors that kind of contributed to that in a lot of sorts. Do you think we might be kind of heading for some of those pitfalls?
Yeah, I think I think if you were to look at like the pitfall of basically low population growth, low productivity growth, and that translates into low interest rates. And those low interest rates eventually get you stuck near 0% interest rates. Japan is functionally stuck for the next, like up to, I think the 10 or 15 year bonds are basically at zero. And that's not the situation the US is at right now, where like the entire yield curve is positive at this point, and it's pretty substantially positive, by which I mean, you know, compared to pre-pandemic, or even the early pandemic. And the US has a lot of advantages in that, you know, productivity growth is higher. The US labor market, even though maybe it's on average weaker than Japan, it's probably more dynamic. It includes more women and minorities. The US has a big immigration advantage and a big innovation advantage. But I still think you're seeing like that same trend creep in, where as societies age, you have less upward pressure on interest rates from, you know, capacity build out for growing populations, and you have more savings demand among older people, and that tends to counterbalance maybe some of the other forces pulling real interest rates up, and you're ended up in a situation where like I said, the real interest rate in the 2010s was arguably slightly negative. Now it's maybe slightly positive. It's very funny from a historical perspective that we're at like we're planning for 4% interest rates and people are like catastrophizing.
Yeah.
I think somewhat rightly, because it's like the interest rate that the US economy can handle has gone down over time. But by a historical perspective, 4% interest rate's nothing,
Yeah.
it doesn't.
How quickly our perspectives change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
But
the one thing I will say, I think if you're saying what did the Fed miss, what did society miss, what did I miss?
Yeah.
It's partly that like we were stuck in a really low productivity growth economy in the 2010s with like a low demand, lots of slack across the economy, low capacity growth, and that pulled real interest rates down. And I think people did not foresee how quickly after the pandemic, how quickly global economies recovered to something resembling pre-pandemic strength, pre-pandemic higher real interest rates. And people expected to be stuck in that sort of demand trap that we were stuck in throughout the 2010s. So maybe, the real GDP growth is higher in the 2020s than the 2010s, and that helps keep real interest rates up. Real productivity growth is higher. That's a possibility.
right, yeah. So let's go on to that previous point you just made, because obviously this is a Fed piling podcast. No, I'm just kidding. But inflation is obviously like a major issue. I'm not going to try to belittle it here, but do you think that the Fed maybe needs to adapt or change its current seemingly black and white view when it comes to how it addresses inflation?
I think it's helpful to like pull a step back from the forecast. If you really want to understand why do organizations act the way they do, it's because of the constraints they're under. And the reason that we developed independent central banks as a concept was that they were supposed to be apolitical stewards of monetary policy, and I think that's correct in a really important way, that like the independent central bank is a critical part of the economy. But I think there's a difference between apartisan and apolitical. It is still very much a political institution, by which I mean it gets under political constraints.
Yeah.
When inflation is so high, I think they feel like they have to respond. And I think you see the Fed is in a separate bowl than like the European Central Bank, for example, where you can very clearly see, okay, if you're looking at nominal growth in the US, it's really strong. If you're looking at wage growth, it's really strong. If you look at, all companies are complaining about labor supply issues and workers are complaining about, wage increases not being enough, but the nominal growth level is still really high. If you look at Europe, you're saying the nominal growth level is really low. You have this massive supply shock from the energy crisis, and the European Central Bank kind of just feels like they have to do something. But in a similar way, I think the Fed sees this number and they're like, oh, we got to do something about this.
Yeah.
They definitely, they have to raise rates somewhat, but I think they feel like, they have to be aggressive to prove that they're doing something. And that's not because they're idiots. They're looking at the economic data and they're just like, I have a completely different view. I think part of it is genuinely that they face a political constraint on, if inflation is too high for so long, it becomes a problem for the people appointed to run the Fed, for the Fed as an organization. What they want least of all in the world is for Congress and the president to say, you guys screwed this up, you guys, it's all your fault. We're going to clean house at this organization, and we're going to take away all of these powers and authorities that we gave you, and we're going to give you new responsibilities that you don't like, as punishment. And so there's definitely some political part of this. I think you see that when Jerome Powell in June was coming out and saying like, hey, gas prices are up a lot. That affects inflation expectations. We really have to raise rates in response to that, even though we don't like to do that.
Yeah.
This is what we have to do. And now the gas prices are coming down. There's no like celebration of being like, actually, that's mission accomplished.
Yeah, right.
There's like kind of looking at the bad parts of the data, because the bad parts of the data are what matter politically, again, political separate from partisan.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in all seriousness, like sometimes the Fed has to be reduced to kind of this approach of either this helps or hurts inflation, just because they're subject to the, you know, scapegoatingness of political parties and of the public. But to move off of that for a second, and I want to talk about where inflation goes from here, because obviously, like as we just talked about, gas prices have come down to like, I believe, yeah, you actually tweeted this, like pre-Ukraine takeover levels. And like, so the past year where we focused so much on like, gas, rent, food as like these major indicators of inflation, kind of doesn't seem like this will always be the case going forward. So to you, like, what does the future of inflation look like in terms of how we assess it and analyze it?
Yeah, and I think you named like the three big components, if you think about it. Gas, rent, and food. And gas maybe standing in for energy as a whole, because I still think we're dealing with issues with electricity prices and natural gas prices that are going to persist for at least a little while longer. But it's true that consumers focus the most on food and gasoline because they buy them constantly, because they're so omnipresent, because there's big neon signs that show you the price of gasoline every time you go outside. So you can't even not notice it if you try. And that coming down, funnily enough, is like, if you look at the University of Michigan or the New York Fed's measures of inflation expectations, they're going down. And I wholly attribute that to gas prices.
Get to know.
And like we were saying before, the Fed was like looking at gas prices being nervous because about inflation expectations. But at like a theoretical academic econ level, they're not supposed to care about gas prices and they're not supposed to care about food prices. What they fundamentally try to care about is the cyclical components. And that basically ends up being rent, because rent is determined in large part by income for workers. And for like, as an example, like full service restaurants where a lot of the cost is the cost of labor, services where the main cost is wages, or one of the most driving costs is wages. And if you're looking at those metrics right now, you're really not optimistic about inflation. If you were looking a year ago, I could have come on this podcast and said, hey, listen, car prices are up, gas prices are up, food prices are up. That's bad. These are supply issues that are negatively affecting the economy, but really outside the purview of what the Fed can control. Now you're in a situation where I'm saying, like, actually, gas prices are down from where they were a few months ago. Car prices are still up, but production's catching up. Those prices hopefully come down over the next year or so.
Yeah.
The big issue is just simply that the total amount of income, total amount of spending in the economy is growing too fast. If you were looking at gross domestic income or gross domestic product, so income or spending in the US over the last 2 quarters, it's basically like 8 to 10% annualized. And like a normal pre-pandemic level would be 4%. No. So you're saying if so you're saying maybe 2.5% is productivity gains, GDP gains, the next 2% is inflation. So if you get 4% income growth, and that's good, that's on target. Right. At some level, when you reach 10%, there's productivity doesn't automatically go up to 8%. I sure wish it would.
Yeah.
But so that income growth level has to come down. And that's a difficult proposition, primarily because the main income growth that the Fed controls is labor income, is worker income. So I think what they're hoping for is that you're back in a situation where, because most of the workers who left during COVID have been hired back, you're going to have that immediate labor demand shock downward and then upward has sort of passed through the system. Now things kind of go back to normal but strong labor market. You get wage growth that's like 5%, 4% instead of 8%. And they'd be very happy with that. And then that passes through. So you get, rent growth that's, 4% instead of right now, I think it's 6 or 8%. And then that passes through to like headline inflation is back down to 2-ish%. That would make them very happy. The problem is that even though from a econ perspective, maybe you can get income growth back down to normal levels by the end of this year, that still wouldn't show up in the inflation data until basically end of 2023, or at least most of the way through 2023. I think if you look at like private data, rent growth is decreasing. That'll show up soonish, but it's decreasing from a level that was like ridiculously high. And so it's not like through the woods yet. And I think that that's the primary worry. And if you're Jerome Powell, like what keeps you up at night is the idea that, in 2024, you're at a hearing in front of Congress and you have to explain why inflation is like 4% right now because, rent growth is so high because these cyclical components are so high.
Yeah. I mean, so how do you go about like distinguishing your analysis for cyclical components of inflation and acyclical ones?
Yeah, I think it's so I probably should have cited this paper when I first spoke about it. This paper I really like. It's Stock and Watson 2019, where they basically went through all of the expenditure components and said which ones are most connected to macroeconomic conditions, and they had a bunch of different variables for macro conditions, which price growth is most connected, and their basic arrangement was like housing prices were number one by a pretty large margin, and then it was like a few labor intensive services, and then it was I think motor vehicles, and then a couple others, and then trickle down. It's like obviously gasoline, prices aren't affected by interest rates unless you want to like completely crush the economy. Then you'll do it, but that's not really with the goal. And food prices similarly, unless people could always continue eating unless you're really in a tough spot. And I think you can make some arguments that like obviously the pandemic's a really weird time. This paper was trying to address an economy that was before 2019. So like is motor vehicles like a cyclical component still, or is it acyclical because we had the semiconductor shortage and all this stuff? Is our food prices cyclical because it's the Ukraine war, it's supply chains, it's people going from restaurants to groceries and then back to restaurants? Or is it cyclical because it's spending growth that translates into people going out to restaurants more, and wage growth that translates into higher prices at restaurants? I think there's a debate about how much that holds to current levels. And on the housing front, I think there's a reasonable take you could have that like the pandemic was the biggest negative shock to housing demand since 2008, and then the biggest positive shock ever because everybody went home. I went back to my parents, as like I said, and millions of other people did. And then lots of people lost their jobs, so they move in with friends or whoever. And then as the economy rebounded, suddenly you have all of these workers who were, they were working in office, now they're working from home, and like their apartments feel claustrophobic, their houses feel tiny, they want more space. So it's like, how much is that is cyclical, from the Fed, from like aggregate macro conditions? How much of it is acyclical from the pandemic and the ensuing recovery? I think there's a debate there. But I come down on the side that at this point, a lot of the inflation, maybe half or so, is from cyclical components.
Right. So do you still think that we need to be wary of supply chain issues that can maybe be concerns for these acyclical and cyclical components of inflation going forward?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think the distinction I would make is that the distinction from earlier about like high prices versus growing prices, where you see this for cars, for example, where like there's, heaven help you if you're trying to buy a used car right now. It's a nightmare, and it's been a nightmare for 2 years, but it hasn't been a nightmare that's been getting worse, which is still, that's a supply chain issue. but it's not a driver of inflation, except in the case that if production picked up, if the car shortage was alleviated, you'd expect prices to come down. That would induce like deflation, would reduce, or disinflation, reduce the level of inflation. So I still worry about that. And I think one thing that was posited by Matt Klein a while ago, and he wrote this piece that was like, what if COVID never ends? And it wasn't directly about like, what if the pandemic is here forever?
Yeah.
But it was what if the things that happened in the pandemic don't unhappen?
Yeah.
You had this supply chain shock. People are spending a lot more money on goods than on services compared to the pre-pandemic time. And everyone was kind of like in the early days, like, yeah, they'll come back once, no one will buy a Peloton once it's 2022 and like they can go outside and bike for real. And it's like, okay, well, we're looking at the data and you're saying people are spending about as much on goods as they were in 2020 as a share of total spending, not as much as they were spending in 2019. So it's an upward shock that's just leveled off, and that takes time for supply chains to catch up to. And pretty critically, it's like, it's hard. It makes it hard for companies to forecast.
Yeah.
Like are people going to go back to a normal where they were buying things more offline in malls than online, or are they going to keep, are they going to buy more stuff online nowadays? That's like a big deal for distribution, for who you hire, for the investments you make in warehousing capacity or retail showrooms. I don't have a good answer to that question. And I think there's a lot of companies that are looking themselves down and going, I don't have a good answer to that question.
Yeah, totally. And I think probably the biggest, pitfall that people have is, we can't go back to this pre-pandemic world. Like, no matter whatever policy we try to do or however we try to approach the future, like there's no going back to what it was pre-2019. I think, a lot of us need to realize that and accept that. Where I kind of want to move next is, as a savant of the labor market yourself, I needed some help addressing some of the labor market reporting that, I come across in the news, because, on the one hand, I see headlines claiming, tight labor market indicated by 20-month streak in job growth or whatever. And then, I turn around and I see headlines saying that employers are finding it easier than ever now to hire, like Verizon saying, oh, recruiting is just so easy. It's so easy, like find people to hire. What goes into like reconciling these two kind of seemingly disjointed headlines? Are there like maybe differences in like the industries they're operating in, or am I missing something in terms of like technical terms of labor markets?
Yeah, I think I get, personally a little frustrated by labor market reporting. And in truth, it's like always hard to communicate economic concepts. Trust me, I know. But I think that a lot of it ends up being extra confusing, where you have like we had the dynamic recently, people were talking about like quiet quitting and then the Great Resignation and blah, blah, blah. And it was all this stuff for like trying to explain the Great Resignation was people quitting their jobs, but they were going and taking other jobs. They weren't like staying at home.
Right.
And quiet quitting, I'm still not even certain what that's supposed to mean. Other than, but I do think there's an interesting point to be made that different companies, different sets of workers have experienced this like labor shortage in very different ways. And I think if you say like, oh, it's a tight labor market that's good for workers, it's very narrowly true. But it's important to recognize the way the workers it is good for and the ways it's good for them, and the companies that can also benefit. If you're the kind of company that has a big economy of scale, can offer generous benefits, and is in an expanding industry, you might be looking at labor costs and saying this is a steal. But if you're a local restaurant, you're hurting yourself over labor costs, and like that is probably good for net productivity. If you think about a worker moving from like being a waiter or a cook to being even just an office worker or something like an electrician or a technician with Verizon, that's probably higher productivity, higher paying work, and is on net better. But what you're going to hear from someone who runs the restaurant is, I can't hire workers. They're all leaving. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
What you're going to hear from Verizon is, oh, there's all these workers who just want to join our company. This is so great.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
Yeah.
And I do think if you're talking to like, I think you have seen more complaints from even larger companies who tend to be the ones who can grow in this kind of tight labor markets, because, like I said, they have better economies of scale. They're more efficient, more productive. They can offer higher wages. I still think from their perspective, if you're looking at unit costs, they attribute a lot of it to labor. The Atlanta Fed does these surveys of business executives, and if you look at like what they attribute inflation to, it's about even between labor costs and non-labor costs. So like I was saying before, whereas like half of it is cyclical, half of it's acyclical. The business are saying half labor, half not labor. But if you were to go in and say, okay, what's the distribution? That distribution has gotten wider. So the company is saying it's actually not affecting our unit costs. There's a higher share, on the lower end, and a higher share on the higher end. And that to me is saying that the different industries, different companies are experiencing this in very different ways.
So then do you think that, this is a workers' market then, in terms of, they have negotiating leverage and that's truly increased? Because obviously, as we're seeing, more and more of them, recently are heading to picket lines and going on strikes for higher wages. Will this pay off for them?
I think there's two maybe separate economic stories here. The first one, you'd say, are workers benefiting? You generally say yes, because wage growth is higher, even though it's not keeping up with inflation. You think that wage growth is stickier than inflation.
Mhm.
If price growth declines, wage growth won't decline perfectly with it. So those price gains will stay, or excuse me, those wage gains hopefully stay as some of the prices come back to a normal growth rate. If you're looking at like lower income workers, they're getting higher raises than higher income workers, which is good for them, good for ameliorating inequality, and good for getting money to the people who need it the most.
Mhm.
If you're looking at from a strikes and unionization perspective, I think people notice an important trend, which is that more workers are unionizing. You saw this with Amazon, you saw this with the SEIU and Starbucks.
Mhm.
And that unionized workers are taking somewhat more aggressive actions, what you're talking about, the rail strike that's going on.
Mhm.
But on the whole, for the last 40 years, you've seen a steady decrease in work stoppages, union actions, unionization levels in the private sector in the US. And so I think people sometimes get this distortion where they're like, oh, unionization picked up from 6.7% to 6.9%. Like, look at that progress. And that's a progress that's like hundreds of thousands of workers. But you're missing the fact that 5 years ago it was 7%.
Yeah.
And for every, couple hundred workers that you're adding at these Starbucks locations, in the background, and people aren't writing stories about, is Teamsters has lost 100,000 members over the last 2 years. And that means the net number of people in unions is lower or about the same as it was before the pandemic, even though you're hearing all these stories. I think that's another thing where it's a man bites dog kind of story. Nobody's going to write a piece that's like, oh, this number that has been going down for 30 years also went down this year. That's a piece no one wants to write. But the piece that's like, hey, this thing that's, everyone knows that, or people don't think about strikes affecting them. here's a strike that might affect you is like an interesting story. I think you also see this sometimes with like in Europe. This was a news story that kind of got pushed under the wayside because it was resolved very quickly. But like the oil and gas workers in Norway threatened to go on strike. And then the government basically was like, no, no, not right now. And the no was like contingent on we're going to negotiate, with the union for this and that. But I think you do see like sometimes these things get resolved in a fairly normal way. Obviously, if you're looking at this just from the perspective of the news and not from the perspective of the data, I think sometimes you can see a big headline and be pushed one way for it. I also think, like with all labor market stories, people want to like read what they want to read. I think sometimes these stories that are like quiet quitting, for example, like I think sometimes that's sold to people who are like in management at companies who are like anxious about their employees. It's like, oh, they're quiet quitting. They're not only doing the work that they're assigned. This explains, I understand it now. And it's like, I think sometimes the positive stories are sold to people who feel like their industry isn't, treating them as well, and they're looking to that for inspiration, or they just enjoy it. And sometimes it can, in both ways, it can distort the picture of like what are workers in total doing. If you look at like satisfaction rates, so people who say they enjoy their jobs basically hasn't changed. So if people are quiet quitting, they're not even telling people they're quiet quitting. But at the same point, it's like, okay, if you're looking at these stories saying, look at this big possible look at this big possible strike action, I think you might miss the fact that like total strike actions have been decreasing for several years. It's a long-winded way of saying sometimes what you see in the media isn't always true.
I'll tell you, numbers without context and confirmation bias plagues to our society.
Yes, it's
unfortunately, we're all guilty of it at some point. Unfortunately, it's just the way it is. Last question for you, kind of wrap this up. How are employers going to reconcile, the fact that many of these strikes and fights for increases in labor wages are happening, and at the same time we are ostensibly in the midst of a recession?
Yeah, I think there's this disconnect people have between like perceptions of the economy and what matters for the economy, and like the Poindextery economic analysis that goes on. And so I think, especially a couple months ago, a lot of the recession vibes were driven in large part by gas prices, food prices, things that are necessary for people, that are rising in prices, understandably make them upset and make them pessimistic about economic outlook, but might not actually hold the most relevant long-term information about the state of the economy. I think if you're as we're talking about this, if you're in a moment where you're saying my specific industry is having labor shortages, or my specific industry is having supply chain issues, how can this interact with what's going on? I generally think that's a better place to start with for your analysis than going like, well, here's the whole economy, let me back down to what that means for me. And so to the Starbucks example, that's a genuine change. If you're just thinking about the one company, the one industry of like fast food or fast coffee, and the one company of Starbucks having so many workers unionized. And I would, point to you and say, well, employment for younger people is way up, employment at food service industries are way down, even though they're offering higher wages. Like we were saying before, lots of people are transitioning to more productive careers. So these companies are struggling to, keep up with the amount of workers they need. I know Starbucks comes in recently and they were like, saying they're struggling with complex drinks because they're hiring so many new people who don't have experience working at Starbucks or working as baristas. And it's like, well, that's, a challenge that's they need to overcome. But it's also saying in this specific industry, the labor market is much stronger. And so that can lead to more unionization. I haven't seen any strikes at Starbucks. I don't know if that was a news story I missed, but the point I'm just trying to make here is it's maybe better to go on an industry by industry basis there. And like I said, you can have vastly different experiences. If you remember, actually a year or so ago, there were all these big stories about like the unions at Google and at Facebook that were like maybe happening, and now that those companies are doing poorly, those talks have kind of evaporated a little bit. It's like, okay, well, this is maybe it's a specific industry story more than it is an aggregate economic story, especially because in the US, like unions are so fragmented by firm rather than by industry, and by there aren't these broad organizations the way there are in maybe Europe or other countries. It was a long-winded answer, but
yeah. Totally makes sense to me. Great way to put a bow on that, by the way. And thanks you so much, Joseph Politano, for taking the time to speak with me today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm always happy to be on.
Awesome.
I hope you enjoyed that. For more content, check out the rest of the videos on my channel. And be sure to look out every Thursday for a new episode.